You're on Chafam Beis, and we're at Boy Romi Bar Chomo. About halfway down the page. Second to last word on the line. First word on the next line is Bar Chomo. Boy Romi Bar Chomo. Romi Bar Chomo had the following question: If there was a chazaka, there was a presumption that a certain eved, a certain slave, belonged to him, to the husband. The get kosav al yadai, and the guy wrote a divorce on the slave's hand. And now the slave is in the possession of the woman. Mahu. What's the halacha? She claims, my husband gifted me this eved along with the divorce that was written on his hand, and therefore I'm currently divorced. And he says no. She says he's given me a gift of this slave with the divorce written on his hand. Or do we say, the slave walked on his own, and there's no evidence. The fact that the slave is in the possession of the woman doesn't mean anything. The slave just walked to the woman's house. So it could be the husband was considering divorcing her with his slave, but he never actually did it. Rava says, typically the Saf Sheikhul is Dayafu. Rava has a question. Well, hold on a second. If it's written on the slave, then it could be forged. In other words, she could hire a scribe to write a divorce on the slave that she took. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. Rami Bar Chama didn't make this up. The idea that a slave who had a divorce written on him could be used as a divorce, or to send a woman, is in the Mishnah already. The Mishnah says it was written on the Eved, it was written on the slave, and he gives her a gift of the slave, then she's divorced. So how does Rav learn the Mishnah? The Rav Kasha Masnisin al Yad Shel Eved. The Mishnah gives an example. On the Eved's hand, the divorce is valid. So the Gemara says Bishlam Masnisin the Rav Kasha Beidim is Sira Verbalotzvi. Al Ram Chama Kasha. Okay, so the Gemara says the Mishnah says the get was written on his hand is not difficult. Why? Because we're talking about the opinion that says Eidim Masira Karting, meaning that the witnesses that witness the giving over the divorce, those are the main witnesses. So therefore, the requirement that the divorce be a document that cannot be forged is not necessary, strictly speaking. As long as you have witnesses that testified that the transaction was kosher, then the document is fine, even if it's a document that could be forged. However, according to Ram Bar Chama, what's the explanation? So Ram Bar Chama where the divorce, instead of being written, was tattooed onto the Eved's back. In other words, the Mishnah also, this is another simple explanation. According to Rava, it could be a simple explanation of the Mishnah. How can you give a divorce on a slave's hand? What about the fact that it can be forged? The answer is, in other words, because you can edit it and change it. So the answer is no. We're talking about a tattooed get. They gave a tattoo of a get, and therefore it cannot be forged without evidence of tampering. Okay, so where says my Havalo? What's the final conclusion with regard to the question of Romi Bar Chama? In other words, does the fact that she holds the divorce, she holds the slave, does that indicate that the divorce was actually given or not? Maybe the slave went to her house. Tashma, let's prove this. Okay. So we have a little bit of background to understand this. This comes up later on in Bav Kama. Obviously, this is true today as much as it's true in the past. If a person is holding something you presume is his, there's no reason to doubt it. Not only that proof is sort of sufficient to require the other person to prove that it belongs to him. It belongs to him if he wants to take it away from you. the concept in Hebrew is called Kol Mash Tachas Yad Adam Hareu Shaloi. Anything that's under a person's own domain is presumed to be his. Why is this? This is the whole discussion, but it's sort of at a basic level. If he has it, we think he's a thief. The only exception to that is animals, because a regular item, he would have to take it if it was his. An animal could have just walked onto his front steps. And therefore, with regard to animals, the fact that it's in your yard does not prove that it's yours. The animal could have easily just walked to your front yard. And similarly, with regard to a slave, the fact that the woman has the slave in her house doesn't mean anything. The slave could have walked to her house. And because there's no presumption of ownership, in other words, we do not say Kol Mash Tachas Yad Adam Hareu Shaloi. The fact that the slave is in her house proves that it's hers. We don't say that because the slave could have gone by herself. So therefore, there's no reason to presume that the divorce is valid. Next question. Boy Roman Bar Chama. Roman Bar Chama has the following question. There was a tablet, and the old version, not the iPad version. Anyway, and it was presumed that it was hers. The get cost of a lot, and there was divorce that was written on it. And now he seems to be the owner. He has the document. Mahu, what's the story? Mi amrinan aknuye akni salei, adilma la yada la aknuye. Okay, so like we said previously, the woman is the one who writes the divorce. Writing the divorce is her expense. However, it must belong to the husband before he divorces her. And now the Gemara's question is, if the husband is holding the document, holding this tablet, ready to divorce her, Mao, what's the story? Do we say that presumably as part of the divorce process, she has gifted him this tablet so that he can divorce her? Or do we say that no, she doesn't know the rule that she must give possession of the tablet over to her husband. And therefore, even if she gave it to her husband, she never really intended on actually gifting it to him. She thought she'll give it to him, and he'll give it right back to her.
The wife is the only one with the right to get. It's how you said she has the right to get.
She has the financial responsibility.
The financial responsibility.
So she has to hire somebody. She has to pay for it.
The husband can't do that if he wants.
Of course,
he can.
Of course. Yeah. Typically, generally speaking, initially it actually was you might imagine it was the husband's responsibility, but the rabbi said Mishum Miguna, they changed it. So in other words, they didn't want to create obstacles for the husband to refuse a divorce.
Oh.
And one of the ways they did that was by requiring the woman to write it. Just like, for example, we relied on very weak types of witnesses. Typically, we wouldn't rely on witnesses that don't even know what they're signing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same thing. If a divorce is ready to be written, we don't want to hold it up for sort of extra stuff. And therefore, as part of that, the woman is the one who writes it. Now the question is, the woman has this right to divorce to herself on her own tablet, and she gives it to her husband to give back to her. Does she understand that when she gives it to her husband, it actually belongs to her husband, and he can refuse to give the divorce and keep the tablet for himself? Or does she understand, and therefore the divorce is valid? Or does she think, no, it's sort of a game, I give it to him, I'll give it back to me, and I don't really have to give it to him? And if the problem is, if she doesn't give it to him, then the divorce is not kosher, because the divorce is not kosher because she does not intend on actually handing it over to him. He must own the divorce when he's divorcing her. Okay, so Gemara brings a few different proofs here. Toshma.
Question, Rabbi.
Yes. Amar Rabbiya, which is the first of the wide lines on 20b. Second word on the line. Amar. Got it?
Yep.
Amar Rabbiya, Toshma. Let's examine this. Okay. This is Rabbi Yehudah ben Bava speaking. Afhu, also he, in other words, Rabbi Yehudah ben Bava, Heir al Kfar Kartan Shahaya B'Tzad Yerushalayim. He testified about a certain small city that was next to Jerusalem. And in that city there was an elderly, wise person. He would loan to everybody in the city. He would write the documents in his own handwriting, and other people would sign. And the rabbis found out about it, and they said there's nothing unusual here. This is perfectly acceptable. Okay, now typically the way it works here, this is again by convention, the lender is the one who writes the documents. I'm sorry, what am I saying? The opposite. The seller is the one who writes the documents.
Okay.
Now, therefore, when you're issuing the loan, who's the seller? Obviously there's property being put up as a lien on the loan, and therefore the seller is who? The seller is the borrower, right? The borrower, the loan may end up serving as the payment for the property the borrower effectively sells to the lender. Does that make sense? As should the borrower not pay the loan, what's going to happen? Effectively, the borrower's property is going to become purchased with the amount of the loan and be sold to the lender, who's the one who issued the loan. So therefore, it has to be that the borrower has to write the document. Because the seller needs to write the document, the borrower needs to write the document, because the borrower in effect is the seller in a loan that's in a secured loan. So hold on a second. Babina Sefer Makna. The contract has to be written by the seller. But like I know over here, it's being written by the buyer, because this elderly gentleman who's very wealthy and giving everybody loans, he's writing the documents. How could he write the documents? The documents have to be written by the seller. It must be it must be that he actually gifts the documents to the borrower, who is also the seller in a secure debt. And therefore, even though it's not actually about who writes it, it's about who owns it. And who owns this loan document? The borrower owns it, because the lender gifted it to the borrower. Okay, so therefore we have clear proof here. Just like the lender gifted the loan document to the borrower, presumably the woman gifted her tablet to her husband. The Gemara says, okay. Rava says there's no proof here. Well, my kosher, what are you trying to prove here? Dilma Zak and Shiny, the other like Nuye. Well, if you're talking about a guy who's elder and wise, presumably he knows the law that he actually has to gift the document. In other words, the seller or borrower must own the document, not the lender buyer. And therefore, if he's a zaken and he's a wise man, obviously he knows this and he actually does it. But that doesn't prove that a regular woman knows the rule. And maybe she does not intend on gifting it to her husband. Rava says, here's the proof. Okay, so let's go through what's an Orav. An Orav is literally a guarantor. Two interesting points worthwhile to make an Orav, because Orav will come up I believe it's quite a few times later in this Masechta and also in Kedushin. What's a guarantor? So obviously guarantor is as it sounds. If you don't pay up a loan, the guarantor pays it for you. So the first thing, as we said, is if you don't pay the loan. First requirement, if you have a guarantor, is that obviously all legal methods have been exhausted to try to collect the debt from a borrower, and only then does the guarantor pay the loan. There's another type of Orav called an Orav Kabbalan. An Orav Kabbalan he's called a guarantor. Kabbalan means to accept. A guarantor that accepts responsibility. Now every guarantor accepts responsibility, but an Orav Kabbalan is literally equivalent to the borrower. You think of him as a co-borrower, and you're just as equally entitled to collect from the Orav Kabbalan as you are to collect from the Orav. As a matter of fact, if anyone has the experience of borrowing money from a gemach, a free loan society, who uses documents that are valid in the court, they require, almost always they require an Arav Kabbalah, an Arav, and it's the Kabbalah variety. And they'll tell you, they'll say, look, we're going to try to collect from the borrower first. We don't have to. We can go straight to you. And you understand that when you're serving as a guarantor, you understand that you're a co-borrower. We don't have to go to the borrower to actually take the money. Now, there's two types of Aravs. There's an Arav who's written into the document. So this would be something like a modern day free loan society. As part of the document, there is a line that says who the guarantor is going to be. And then only after that, the witness can sign the document. However, there's another type of Arav, which is they wrote a loan document, end of story. And then 2 months later, and somebody went ahead and underneath the loan document, he signed as an Arav. That's called Arav Hayotz La'achar Chitim Shtaros. He's a guarantor, but he was not there ab initio when this affair started. He only came later on, and we'll discuss. It's not so simple that such a person actually accepts responsibility. The Gemara is very concerned that maybe actually what happened was the lender was beating up the borrower on the street, and somebody to placate the lender said, "Okay, I'll sign the document as an Arav," and then all of a sudden he was placated. What do they call these people? Loan sharks and
enforcers,
creditors chasing after people. Not a new thing. Been around for a while. Okay, so we have here a story. Now the Gemara will deal with it. We'll get to later in Kedushin, or later in Masechta Gittin and Kedushin. We'll discuss all these types of Aravs at length. Then again above Basra, of course. But for now, you have an Arav who's written after Chitim Shtaros. He does not collect from Mishubadim. He doesn't collect from assets that are no longer in the domain of the guarantor, only assets that are currently in his domain. 1 second. Now, the question here is, hold on a second. The Arav of the guarantor serves just like a seller, right? Because if the loan isn't collected from the borrower, it's collected from the guarantor. If the guarantor has nothing to pay, what happens? His property is taken, which effectively is a sale. He is selling his property for the loan that was given to somebody else, to the borrower. Therefore, he's a seller. Hold on a second. If he's a seller, then what happens? He needs to write the documents. Now over here, there's no way he wrote the document because actually he signed as a guarantor after the document was already written. So this clearly proves that what happened was in order to get him to sign the document, the lender actually had to give the document over to the guarantor to get him to sign it. And similarly, we should say by divorce that if a woman wrote a divorce, if a woman wrote the divorce on a tablet, then presumably she gifted her tablet to her husband to be able to give it back to her. So Rashi says no proof here. My kasha, why is it difficult? The other laknuye. Maybe there's a difference between men and women. Maybe men are typically more involved in business. They know more of the rules of documents. So in this case, they are much more serious about actually giving their documents over to the other party. Whereas with regard to a woman writing her own divorce, maybe she doesn't realize that she actually has to completely gift the tablet over to her husband. Okay, Rashi says next proof. Finally, this is the clear proof. Rabbinically, the woman has to write the divorce. A man has to write a receipt. So let's say he pays out a ksuba, and he wants the woman to write him a receipt, which would prevent her from collecting twice. He has to pay for that receipt to be written. Now, hold on a second. The woman here is paying for the document to be written, but yet we say every divorce is kosher. Why? Because presumably we know that the woman is given over the document to her husband. She understands the document belongs to her husband. And we say it's valid, and therefore, presumably, the story with the tablet is the same thing. A woman who writes her divorce on a tablet, gifts the tablet to her husband, as part of the divorce process. Amarova, Kotsav get Vinosni Biad Avdi. The Kotsav Shtar Matona Olaf. Kanasim is Garashis by. Right, so he writes the divorce on his slave's back, and he gives he gifts the divorce, which is the slave. He gifts the slave to the woman who the divorce is written on. So what happens? Two things happen. First of all, she has another slave. Second of all, she's divorced. Somewhere says, how does a woman acquire the slave? The slave can run around. He can move around. If he can move around, how exactly is the woman acquiring him? He's standing, he stopped moving, but Rava says, if while he was moving, it would not be possible to acquire him, then it isn't impossible to acquire him when he's sitting down either. And the Gemara says that this is not really such a difficult question. We're talking about where the Eved was tied together. So he was tied to a post. He couldn't move. He couldn't move, so it's very easy to be kind of him. Just write a document. You acquire the document and you acquire the slave, because at this point the slave is immobile. He can't be moved. And therefore the woman acquires a slave, and together with acquiring the slave, she also acquires her divorce.
In the end, the woman needs to have the get, doesn't she?
Yeah, the get is on the slave's, it's on the slave's back.
No, but I mean, just in general.
I hope it's not written in washable ink.
Or the slave
Back
dies,
to
then
the-
she doesn't have the divorce anymore.
So the mission said, so first of all, it's not technically speaking, it's not a requirement. What would happen in this case is presumably she'd ask the court to write her up a document saying that they saw her divorce. Okay. Okay. But Amarova, Kosovo Gav Nosne Bechatzeroi. He took a divorce, he put it into a yard. The Kosovo Shtar Matana Love, Kanosim is Garashis. So he took the divorce, put it in a field, and then he gifted the whole field to the woman. She's kind of the field, and she's divorced. With Tzricha, it's necessary to talk about a slave, and it's necessary to talk about a property. To Yeshmin and Eved, if I would have just known that the divorce of a slave is valid, Havamina Dafka Eved, Abachotzer Ligzim Shinchatzera Balachamikan. I would think specifically a slave, the husband can gift the slave with divorce written on his back. But a property, maybe not. Why? Because Chatzera Balachamikan. What does that mean? Let's say the husband knows the woman's father is about to die, and he only has one child. It's his wife. So what he does is he writes a divorce. He puts it in the father's property, the woman's father's property. Then the woman's father dies, and all of a sudden she inherits the property with the divorce written in it. So she actually acquires a divorce. Is that valid or not? Answer is no, not valid, and the reason is because he did not give it to her. If he writes divorce on a slave's back, on a let's say he writes divorce and puts it in the property, and then he gives her the property, that's called giving her the divorce, because the property comes with the divorce. That's the giving. However, if the father dies and all of a sudden she acquires it, he never gave it. There was nothing in the acquisition of the get that had anything to do with him. It had zero to do with him. It all had to do with the father dying. And therefore, because it's possible with regard to a piece of property to have her divorce be acquired by her, but she's not actually divorced because it's Chatzer Habol Achar Mikan. Maybe we should prohibit all types of divorces given over through property. So therefore, it's necessary to say that a divorce on property is valid. If it would have just said in other words, if he put the divorce in the property and himself gifted her the property, that's valid. I would think that specifically property, because the only way to acquire a slave, the only way to get divorced through acquiring a slave who has divorce written on his back, is when the slave is bound together and immobile, he cannot move on his own. So then ligs are kafus after she'ena kafus. We shouldn't allow any types of slaves because maybe they'll confuse a slave that's tied together with a slave that isn't tied. Kamash Malan, that both of them are valid. Amar Abaya. Abaya has an interesting question here, and the Gemara will quickly reject this question. Mechti, hold on a second. Chotzer mehecha is Rabbi. How do we know the concept that a woman can acquire a divorce in her courtyard? How do we know this? Miyada, because it says he puts the nosan biyada. He takes the divorce and puts it in her hand. A property is like your hand, just like what's in your hand is yours. Whatever's in your property is yours. And that's how we know, for example, that if the woman owns a piece of land, the husband can put the divorce in the piece of property, and that's considered valid. She acquires the divorce through her property, because her property is representative of her hand. Hold on. Just like her hand, if the husband puts a divorce in her hand, whether she likes it or not, she's divorced. If he literally pries her hand open and puts the divorce inside and closes her hand in it, she's divorced. She can't say that I don't want it. It's too bad. Divorce works even if the woman doesn't want. And therefore, a property, the type of divorce of property should also work whether she wants it or not. But hold on a second. This makes sense if she owns the property. But if you're gifting her the property, if you're gifting her the property, can't gift it to her if she doesn't want it. So how is it? So in other words, when you're gifting her a property that has a divorce in the property, you have the property, the guy wrote the divorce, it's on a pedestal in the middle of the property. And he says, okay, here, I'm giving you by picking up this piece of this computer case, you're acquiring the property. Kinyan Chalipin, which is valid kinyan for property. So she acquires the property. Hold on, she had to agree to acquire the property. If she didn't ever agree to it, the property doesn't belong to her. If that's the case, it's not comparable to Yada, to her hands. Because over here, she has to willingly comply with acquiring the property. With regard to her hand, she doesn't have to comply. It's not up to her. The husband can divorce her whether or not she wants it. So Baya says, because this method of divorce would not work against her will, it should not be a valid method. So the Gemara says, hold on, is that true? That a divorce cannot be done through, in other words, is it true that because chotzer property is learned out of a hand, and the hand has two methods of divorce, both of her own volition and against her volition, so to a property must have both components. And if you're using a property in a way which only one method is valid, in other words, your own volition, so then it wouldn't be valid the other methods. I'm sorry, if only one method is valid, neither method is valid. In other words, because you can't force her to accept the property, therefore, even if she does accept the property, it should not be a valid giving of divorce. So hold on a second. Every time a woman makes a messenger to accept the divorce on her behalf, nobody could force her to make a messenger, and yet this type of shlichus works. In other words, nobody ever questioned the fact that a shliach l'kabbalah, a messenger appointed by the woman, is valid, even though that messenger cannot be appointed against her will. The husband could send a messenger against her will. The woman cannot receive a divorce through a messenger against her will, because she has to appoint that messenger to receive her divorce. So the Gemara says, Abaya is not impressed with this question because first of all, Abaya's question was based on the notion that chotzer is learned from yad, from her hand. Her hand requires both methods, willingly and against her will. However, the source that a shliach can serve as her agent is from the fact that he can send the divorce. V'shalach v'shilcha. We'll learn about it a little bit later. And therefore, there was never a requirement that a messenger must be able to divorce her against her will. And therefore, it's incomparable. Or alternatively, actually, we do find a divorce that receives the divorce on behalf of the woman, even if the woman doesn't want it. And what's an example of that? A father who married off his young daughter, young girl who's not yet mature, he accepts the divorce on her behalf. And that's, again, whether or not she likes it or not. And therefore, we do find that there is some sort of shliach, a messenger, who's able to accept the divorce against the will of the woman.
All right, page addition, please.
We're now on the last line of Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. I'm about to turn the page.
21A.
21a.
Okay.
Okay, so we learned that you can write a divorce on the horn of an ox and give her the ox, or on the hand of a slave and give her the slave. Third to last word on the page. Bishlam, we got Eved, next page. I understand the hand of a slave. You can't cut off the hand. So therefore, according to one opinion, that you cannot divorce using live animals or live people, then obviously you can't divorce with the slave. However, Elakar and Shapara, you wrote it on the horn of an ox, cut it off. Why can't you divorce? In other words, why can't you write a divorce on the, even if you hold you can't divorce with a live animal, so don't write it on the skin, write it on the horn. And the Mishnah says you write it on the horn, it's not valid according to that opinion. Why is it not valid? Just cut off the horn and give it to her. Karen Shapara, cut it off and give it to her. The Gemara says, Amakra v'kosav v'nasanla. It has to be that from the moment the divorce is written, it's able to be given. Does not require it for it. There can't be a requirement to cut it. And therefore, if you hold you cannot give her the animal as divorce, so you need to cut it off, then the writing of the divorce is invalid if you have to cut it. If you hold you can give her a live animal, so then there's nothing stopping you. You write the divorce on the horn, and then you give her the animal. But if you hold the animal is not kosher as a substrate or as a paper for the divorce to be written on, so then the fact that you can cut it would not kosher that divorce.
But you could cut the horn off first and then write it.
Correct. Absolutely. Okay, and now discussing the material, the paper that the divorce can be written on, let's get on to the next Gemara, which is Rabbi Dovid Yehudah says you cannot divorce with a live animal. My time out, Rabbi Dovid Yehudah, what's the reason? Tanya, we learned, Sefer, the man has to give his wife a book of divorce. Only a Sefer, it has to be specifically a book, a piece of paper. Minayin the rabbi is called over. How do we know that anything is included, anything that you can write on? You write it. You can write it on anything. So why does the Torah say it has to be a book? We say the lowest common denominator is between a book and between writing and anything is that anything is not alive and it's not food. So you can write on a leaf, you can write on a board, you can write on whatever you want, except for things that are food or things that are alive. Okay, Rabbanon, what do the rabbis do? Ikasav b'sefer, you have to write it to her on a sefer, k'amrit. Then I would agree with you that a book is necessary. However, hashadach sefer says it's a sefer. Sefer means a few things. Sefer means book, but sefer could also mean story. The sefer actually means l'sfiras dvarim hudasa. It means that the divorce has to have a certain story in it. This man, this woman, she's permitted to marry whoever she wants, etc. There's a certain order of things, but there's no requirement at all for any. The divorce can be written literally on anything. There's no requirement for it to be written on anything specific. Okay, hold on a second. So if that's the case, hi v'kosav ma'avdilei. According to Rabbi Yossi, v'kosav was telling you that you could write it on anything, because until v'kosav, I would say you have to write it in a book. V'kosav tells me I could write it on anything. I could write it on a board. According to the rabbis, what do you need v'kosav for? According to the rabbis, there was never a requirement in the first place to have it being written on any specific type of material. So if there never was a material requirement, why does Torah need to say v'kosav? The Gemara says, the only way to divorce a woman is to write her a divorce. You can't give her money, and that money should serve as a divorce. I would have thought we should compare divorce to marriage. Just like you marry a woman with an item of value, money, let's say, or anyone. So you should be able to divorce a woman with money as well. That no. can only divorce by writing a divorce. You can't divorce with money. V'idach, hold on. So how does Rabbi Yossi know you can only divorce with money, with writing and not with money? So he says, "Mi sefer krisis, sefer karsa ve'ein davar achar karsa." Only the book, in other words, the written document, that's what serves as the vehicle that divorces her. But you can't divorce her by giving her a gift. V'idach, so okay, so what do the rabbis do from sefer karsa? In other words, the rabbis say when we talk about a sefer krisis, a book of divorce, it means they're completely separate. If there's a condition in the divorce that requires them to stay in any way if that condition is in any way forever, the divorce is not valid. For example, let's say Hiditanya, like we learned. He says, here's your divorce on condition that you don't drink wine. You can never drink wine for the rest of your life. If you drink wine for the rest of your life, the divorce is invalid. Or you never go to your father's house forever. The divorce is not valid. Ein zeh krisis. Why? Because they're still connected. Because at any time, if she breaks the condition, they go back to each other. And therefore, it's not a valid divorce. And that's what they learn from sefer krisis. However, if he gives an end date to his condition, for example, he says, ad shloshim yom, for the next 30 days, harei zeh krisis, that's a valid divorce. The idach, and the other opinion, mikaris krisis. Rabbi Yossi says he learns it after the fact that the word krisis is plural. Krisis means divorce, separation. The fact that the word krisis is plural, therefore we know, number one, that the divorce has to be a written document, so to speak. It can be written on anything, but it has to be a written document, and not, you can't divorce a woman with money. And number two, according to Rabbi Yossi, is that you have one of these conditions that lasts forever, the divorce is not valid. And the rabbis say, they don't point to anything extra from the fact that the word krisis is plural.